Felt like something was near me.
All over the place.
Holy.
It looks like it had lights on it, and I'm not delusional.
Major sighting here.
There's something behind you.
Searching for the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Is not an alien force already among us?
These glowing objects crash, and then hundreds of red eyes are coming at them.
It had 6 fingers, not 5.
Expanding your consciousness.
Apparently a Sasquatch walked across something.
These impressions look like giant knee prints in the mud.
Pondering what could be.
The pilot encountered this object.
It's bigger than ghosts. I don't show anything on radar.
I'm in it for debunking, not to perpetuate a UFO myth.
Traveling close to the speed of light. Between twilight and the witching hour. Somewhere between abnormal and paranormal.
I'll be in your head before you wake up.
When the lights go down, the strange comes out. Into the Paranormal.
Well, tonight we are going to head in a direction in which, I am most fascinated with, because, not everything that we talk about here on this program is something that really is, let's say a 100% thing in the flesh, something that you can reach out and touch, right? I mean, most things that we talk about here on this program, you have to certainly have an open mind about. And the subjects in which we're going to talk about here tonight are no different. From the cold, dark depths of a secret dungeon somewhere deep in the remote Pacific Northwest, it is a privilege once again this weekend to be spending some time with you. I know a little bit unannounced, but I love you just the same for tuning in, and I'm thrilled to have Brian Weimer on on the phone tonight as my guest from the state of Alabama, as we're going to talk about many subjects that I think will get you to think about in a different way. What is being hidden from us? How deep does it go? Based on research into real-life conspiracy theories that many have questioned for decades, Brian takes a fictional look into a topic that has divided the globe and may not be so fictional after all. Brian is a longtime fan of science, thriller, and horror, and author of supernatural thrillers exploring the universal conflict between good and evil. His new book, The VERTICON File from Jumpmaster Press, is now available, so it's a privilege to welcome you to the program, Brian.
Hi, thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So tell us about the premise of this book and why you chose to write it and the subject material that it deals with specifically.
Sure, absolutely. The VERTICON File is basically the product of a lot of different things, conspiratorial related and whatnot. And the whole flat Earth subject, which is I've always found fascinating, especially for the last year or so as it's kind of grown and become more prevalent, more prominent. That along with the whole thing, did we really go to the moon? Were the Apollo missions legit? That's always been an interest to me. So really, it was the culmination of all of these different things, conspiracy subjects, going from like Illuminati-related stuff and secret societies to the JFK assassination, 9/11. All of these things are referenced in the VERTICON File in some capacity. So really, the VERTICON is kind of a collection of different conspiracy theories, even though it explores one or two of them in greater detail, if that makes sense.
It does, and so kind of what I was alluding to there, Brian, was the fact that, I mean, conspiracy theories just in nature are something that, are kind of more fiction. They're not as factually based as maybe some grounded scientific studies.
Sure. Well, you always hear the truth is stranger than fiction. And even, the truth is often hidden in plain sight. And I think there's a stigma about the conspiracy theories. People hear the term conspiracy theories, and that's become a trigger word. And a trigger word is intended to evoke a certain response in people. And a lot of times, the response nowadays is basically one where people tend to roll their eyes. Oh, that couldn't be true. It's a conspiracy theory. But in actuality, a conspiracy is just it's a plot. It's a scheme that's done in secret. And we know that groups do that all the time, political, military, scientific, medical, in a lot of different ways. So I think it's just coming to terms with the fact that, a lot of things are plotted in secret that the population doesn't know about. For sure.
Yeah, there's no reason that the subjects that you talk about in the VERTICON file could be 100% as presented. It is feasible, physically possible for this all to exist.
Right. I wanted the book to basically represent issues that people were familiar with, are within the culture, or prevalent nationally and internationally, and aren't so far removed from basically where we live, the reality that we're in, things that people have considered, because basically nobody has all the answers, for sure. That's why we're here, to explore, to ask questions. And the question that the VERTICON file asks as a conspiracy thriller is, what if this were true? What if in actuality these things were true? How would that affect your life? How would that affect my life? How would that affect people on a sociological level? So it dares to ask these questions. But yeah, absolutely, the subjects that the VERTICON file explores are not in the realm of fantasy that are so far out there, like Lord of the Rings and all of these other things. That and I love Lord of the Rings, by the way, but sometimes it's great to read a book that's a little bit more grounded in issues that are closer to home, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so, Brian, tell us about what your childhood was like. What was your favorite sci-fi and horror material at a young age?
Sure. I grew up being a huge fan of science fiction, a huge fan of horror, a huge fan of the supernatural, the paranormal, UFOs, ghosts, the Bermuda Triangle, Area 51, all these things. But, I loved Star Wars growing up. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I'm a huge classic Doctor Who fan, Battlestar Galactica fan. But in terms of horror, I love, Alien and John Carpenter movies, everything from old slasher movies to haunted house movies, and everything in between that you could possibly think of. Even things like Mothman Prophecies really spoke to me because it's based off of actual events, and things of that nature. Yeah.
And Brian, do you find yourself open-minded?
Oh, absolutely. I think years and years of watching science fiction and horror has kind of piqued my interest, and also the fact that I'm left-handed. So that means I'm right-brained. So I'm always thinking of interesting stories to tell, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm a storyteller, and I enjoy telling stories that the child in me would love to hear. That person that's curious about the unknown. Like I said before, the truth is stranger than fiction. So absolutely, I love all of those things. The paranormal, the supernatural, and everything like that.
And also the conflict between good and evil is something that has always fascinated you as well.
Absolutely. Well, I believe the world we all live in, we're bombarded with having to make good decisions and bad decisions, and obviously we see the state of the world today, and there are a lot of bad things that happen. And so the whole issue that we could be influenced by beings that we can't exactly see, for example, whether you want to call them interdimensional beings, which I refer to in some of my other books, not in the VERTICON file, because the VERTICON file is not a supernatural thriller. But I love the topic of fallen angels, and even the Nephilim, and all of these things that we can't see in the other realm, in the supernatural realm, in beyond our normal human sight, has always fascinated me. So that's played a huge influence in a lot of the stories that I want to tell, for sure.
And Brian, you mentioned the lunar missions and the fact that, consider the thought that our governments may not have been truthful about what actually has been happening up on the moon. What are your thoughts on the lunar missions?
Yeah, this is a very interesting subject, and a lot could be said, but the more research I've done over the past decade, looking at the lunar footage from the Apollo 11 mission and all of these things, has thrown a lot of things into doubt, and for a lot of people, and not just myself. And even more so the fact that was 50 years ago, that was 1969, and today, even NASA has come out and said, you know what, we don't have the technology to do that anymore because it was destroyed.
Exactly.
And that just sets up a huge red flag for a lot of people. And you're thinking of an organization like NASA that was basically founded by Nazi scientists, Operation Paperclip, if you go back and research that, and basically held together by Freemasons that are good at keeping secrets. You have a lot of people that are really good at keeping secrets. Coupled with the fact that they sent a lot of guys up to the moon in a tin can some decades ago, but they say they can't do that now because they can't get beyond low Earth orbit. And even a lot of the representatives and astronauts have come out and said, you know, we can't get beyond low Earth orbit anymore. Or, you know, the Van Allen belt, if you're familiar with that. There's just a lot of red flags that go up. And that's not even speaking of the actual footage from the mission itself, which there's a whole lot of issues with lighting and shadows in places they shouldn't be, and all of these issues that I won't even get into. But it's very interesting to study. Even if you've never given it any thought, it's very, very interesting to study. Just, you know, go on YouTube and pull up some of these videos, some of this footage, and it's you'll start to go down the rabbit hole as well.
Well, but on the premise, you would think that technology would have improved 50 years in the future, not that we would be taking steps back.
Right. Well, supposedly we have greater technology in our cell phones now than they had on the shuttle back in 1969. So that in itself is a bit of an awakening, really. And the fact that if you think about it, from 1969 even till today, there have only been maybe, a couple movies that have been made about the moon landings, one of which is obviously Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks. And then all of a sudden, within the last few months, this new movie comes out called First Man. And that's the movie starring Ryan Gosling, about how they achieved that. So it's kind of similar to the movie The Right Stuff back in the 80s, if you remember that film. But in that film, they really didn't get beyond low Earth orbit. It's mainly about how the astronauts got acclimated to the training into the whole agency and so on and so forth. So I find that interesting as well. The fact that with NASA being called into question by more things than ever, and the flat Earth movement growing, all of a sudden they decide to release this movie called First Man. So, which in a lot of ways is diametrically opposed to what the VERTICON file is about in virtually every way. So, but basically, with the tagline of the book, the VERTICON file, is the truth won't remain hidden forever. And I believe that wholeheartedly, is that we've all in some capacity been lied to, whether we realize it or not, even down to what they put in our food and, Big Pharma and health and nutrition, all of this kind of stuff. So to me, it's not that big of a leap that NASA and the lunar landings, that we weren't told the complete truth about that whole thing. And there's actually a line of dialogue toward the beginning of the book where one character says to the other, he says, that's one small life for man, one giant deception for mankind. And how easy would it be for a large agency to deceive a large group of people? So just throwing it out there.
Yeah. The character Rick Donovan is the focal point of the VERTICON file. Tell us about his character.
Sure. Rick Donovan is a journalist for the Washington Post, which I did quite a bit of research on in the process of writing the book. And he's been a journalist for the better part of 2 decades. So he has he's an award-winning journalist, he's very good, very proficient. He's won a lot of awards. Well, he's contacted by someone through email anonymously who tells him about this event that's predicted, this disaster, and Rick dismisses it, but within 2 days following that email, the event occurs exactly as predicted, down to the magnitude and the exact time, the minute to be precise. And that
almost one of those events where it was foretelling the future.
Yes, yeah, kind of prophetic in nature in a lot of regards, but that gets his attention. But as a journalist for the Washington Post, he's used to following every lead that he possibly can to get a story. So he thinks there's a story here, and if he can get a story, it might be a pretty interesting story to tell. And so he starts down this path, having no clue where it's going to take him, and it soon takes him into some dangerous places.
Yeah, and so as far as the evidence, do you talk about much of the scientific evidence on some of these subjects? Flat Earth, the lunar missions, the JFK conspiracies, secret societies. Will we find much of that in your book?
Yeah, some things are explained more than others, and then some things are hinted at, because obviously if I were to get into greater detail about all of these things, it'd be a 300,000-word book. But I had to keep it down to a reasonable size. But in terms of the two main things that I really go into, one of them deals with NASA and that whole possible conspiracy. But I hint at 9/11, the JFK assassination, secret society, especially the Illuminati, and the fact that there could be these controllers over everything, over the banking system, over all of these things that are these group of people that essentially want to control the world. And it sounds like something from a science fiction movie, actually. But getting down to really what the book delves into and really explores is, you asked about the science of all these things. I do that as much as I can without making it boring, because it's easy to begin writing a textbook, and I had no desire to do that, but I wanted to keep the story moving along, explaining things that I felt needed to be explained back to, especially something called the Antarctic Treaty. And if you don't know anything about the Antarctic Treaty, this is something that began in 1959, where basically every nation signed this treaty that they don't lay claim to Antarctica, and that basically nobody can just go there, that it's off limits. Research stations, military, they can go there, and so on and so forth. But in terms of the general public, we can't just go there. Neither you nor I or anyone else can decide, you know what, I think I'm going to take a trip to Antarctica and explore to see if there's something there. And there have been stories, everything theorized from extraterrestrials, hollow Earth, Nazi bases, UFOs, all of these things, all of these theories about Antarctica. And I found the subject extremely interesting over the last few years. So there's a lot of references to Antarctica. Actually, the book begins with an expedition in Antarctica. But as the story unfolds, there's a lot more that we learn about Antarctica, as well as some of these military missions that are documented. Operation High Jump in 1947, that was led by Admiral Byrd. Operation Deep Freeze was another one. That's 1955. And we know that in 1958, NASA was founded, DARPA was created. They deal with super soldiers and so on and so forth. 1959, like I said, the Antarctic Treaty. But then in 1962, there was something called Operation Fishbowl, which involved high-altitude nuclear testing, which was part of the greater project called Operation Dominic. And now that all leads up to the 1969 Apollo 11 missions. So if you go back and look at the timeline of all of these things and all of these operations that involved exploring Antarctica, it would seem to indicate that they discovered something in Antarctica that caused them to want to do all of these tests, these high altitude tests, to discover how far, what's going on, with the higher, the upper atmosphere. How far they did a lot of deep drilling tests after Operation High Jump, Operation Deep Freeze. How far down can we go? So it's basically the way people would respond if they discovered they were in an enclosed system. And actually, what's interesting, there's a quote by Bill Nye, the science guy that everybody knows, that says that he really wishes that this generation would understand that that we're in an enclosed system. There's nowhere to go. So with that, that's a whole nother component of, have we been lied to about where we are, who we are, the Earth itself. So these are questions that I was interested in asking. But the Antarctic Treaty and all of these historic military operations play a huge part. And I go into pretty good detail about explaining exactly what all that involved and what possibly went down.
Brian Weimer is my guest. He is author of The VERTICON FILE. We'll continue with him. From the cold, dark depths of a secret dungeon somewhere deep in the remote Pacific Northwest, I'm Jeremy Scott. Don't go anywhere.
Save your data and listen for free by calling 701-719-9703, courtesy of TalkStream Live. Into the Parabnormal, traveling as close to the speed of light as the radio waves will allow without frying ourselves.
Brian Weimer, my guest, author of the VERTICON FILE from Jumpmaster Press. 855-790-8255. That's 855-790-8255. In North America or outside North America, 503-506-0396, ITP51 on Skype. And we've been talking about all sorts of conspiracy theories. There's also a political side to this, although, Brian.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of times when you get into talking about conspiracy stuff, it takes on a political dimension to it as well. And so it certainly hints. Well, also the fact that the book starts out with Rick Donovan being a reporter for the Washington Post, which is actually in Washington, D.C. And that's an interesting place. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., I have. And I lived in Virginia for a few years and went up to D.C. and went to some of the places there. And there's a lot of interesting things about that city as well, and a lot of conspiracies involving that city. But yeah, the political environment is very instrumental because the main character, Rick Donovan, is basically he lives day in and day out, basically rubbing shoulders with a lot of these political figures, a lot of senators and a lot of politicians. So that's a part of his world. He knows that world. He writes articles regularly dealing with different political aspects, what's going on in the nation, political, financial, so on and so forth. But I have to be honest with you. I have never been a huge political someone that is just so interested in politics. That's never been my forte. My brother, on the other hand, he could tell you everything about that sort of thing. But I know enough about that arena. But I believe that a lot of things politically are very controlled. It's an interesting subject. Again, that's another rabbit hole we could easily go down. Dealing with the political structure, infrastructure of the nation, and how that sets the backdrop for the VERTICON file, because the book takes place in the world that we all live in. It's a modern day conspiracy, political, scientific thriller, if you even want to consider it in those terms. But the backdrop does take place in the real world, in 2018, under the Trump administration. So it's not in some alternate universe where there's some other president and some other history, or World War II never happened or anything like that. It's very much a modern day thriller, and that takes place where we all live and where we all are. And there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of economic instability going on, and the story takes all of that into account. So I hope that kind of answers that question, at least on some level, even though I could talk about a lot of different aspects of that. Yeah.
And so Brian, taking us to the flat Earth equation, part of this equation, that movement, probably I would say maybe within the last 5 years has really, we want to call it grown, blown up. Now there's even efforts for someone to come up with the ultimate evidence to prove some of these flat Earth believers wrong. Some cold hard cash being offered up for somebody who can provide the evidence to these flat earthers as to why the Earth is not flat. What's your take on the flat versus round Earth conspiracy theory?
It is an interesting debate, and one that I definitely wanted to explore in the VERTICON file, because I honestly don't think it's been done before in terms of this book. But basically, the globe is the biggest conspiracy possibly. The fact that we've been indoctrinated into what's called the heliocentric theory, which is that we revolve around the sun and it takes a year, and there's all these rotations going on, versus what's called, and the book explains this as well, what's known as the geocentric theory, where the Earth is stationary and everything revolves around us, and that the sun and the moon are a lot smaller and a lot closer than we've been led to believe scientifically. So the whole model, I think a lot of people, they hear the word flat Earth, and like I said before, that's a trigger word, and automatically people roll their eyes because they think, oh, that's ridiculous. How can people be so stupid to believe that the Earth is still flat? But if you really begin to look into it, you'll learn that the subject actually warrants further investigation. And there's this misconception that, well, if the Earth is flat, then, won't you fall off the edge and all this kind of stuff. But the whole flat Earth model revolves around the perimeter of the Earth being something called the Antarctic Circle. The fact that Antarctica isn't a continent that we've been told and the way that it's been explained to the general public, that it's a circle that goes around. And so if you're going around the world, that you can circumnavigate the world through going basically in a circle just as well as going around it as if it were a globe or a sphere. And so that's basically the model for a lot of people who might not be familiar with the flat Earth model. But I find it extremely interesting. But yes, this whole subject has really exploded over like the past few years. I would say since 2015 seemed to be a year that it just overnight, it seemed like it began to get more attention and people became interested. And I have to be honest with you, Jeremy, the first time I saw videos or whatnot on YouTube on this subject, I thought it was ridiculous too. I'm thinking, really? Flat Earth? I mean, this is 2018 or whatever it was at the time, 2017, 16. And people still believe that the Earth is flat. It's ridiculous. Haven't we proven that with, we've gone to the moon and sent probes to Mars and all these types of things. But the more I began to look into it, basically for my own curiosity, thinking I'm going to disprove this with, and no problem. But the exact opposite happened. And I began to have more questions and became more curious about the fact that, what if that we've been lied to about this? And, it's because it's not so far a ridiculous topic as being lied to about something really small. I mean, a lie is a lie, and this is just on a more grand scheme of things. And so this is what the VERTICON file really explores is if we have been lied to, why have we been lied to? Because it's more about there are reasons for everything, and people don't just plot and scheme things for no reason at all. There has to be an agenda behind it. And so I really delve into what the agenda could be. What's to gain by perpetuating this belief in the globe model as everybody is taught to believe. I mean, one of the first things that's set in front of us when we're like 1 or 2 years old is this globe. And, people saying this is where we believe. And so that image is indoctrinated into our brain. And that's why a lot of people, this is a very controversial subject for a lot of people. And it stirs up a lot of anger in a lot of people. A lot of people get extremely aggressive talking about this. So it tends to be in some circles not a popular subject. It's an interesting subject, but it can also stir up a lot of animosity, which is interesting because I'm just asking the question, what if? My story asks, what if it were true? So, but yeah.
Yeah, and why would the government necessarily, if they had the evidence that the Earth was flat or the Earth was round, why would they sit on that information? Why would they cover it up? I mean, I don't see that as a national security threat if the evidence for one, and same for Planet 9. They want to say that Planet 9 or Planet X, Nibiru, doesn't exist, even though there's evidence of such. And they just want to say that all these things, that ETs and aliens and UFOs, that all of this stuff doesn't exist. Certainly those subjects, we can argue as to why the government would lie about something like that, why they wouldn't want to release the truth on that. But on something as minute as whether or not the Earth is flat or whether the Earth is round, I mean, what's to gain or what's to lose by covering that up?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And that is one of the things that I explore in the VERTICON file is what could be the motive, what could be the reason for the agenda to conceal something as vast as the shape of where we live. And personally, there's several different answers to that. One of them could be the fact that if scientifically, you could talk about how the people believe, there was a Big Bang. If you believe in the Big Bang, you believe in evolution. you believe in this evolutionary model. You believe that we come from that. And see, the flat Earth, if people believe that, there's more of an argument that could be made for creation versus natural evolution. And so, and that's a huge thing for a lot of people, because science is very aimed at us being the process of natural formation, or as Rob Skiba likes to say, from goo to you by way of the zoo. The way that we formed, if we were formed from like single cell organisms instead of we were actually created. So there is this whole debate on creation versus evolution, and flat Earth would basically silence that whole argument. Is that how could there have been an evolutionary process if we are stationary, we are on a flat Earth or on a plane instead of a planet? Or if the possibility that we've been lied to, that what if there are no other planets? Because a whole extra dimension to this whole argument has to do with astronomy. And there's a lot of, and you can look this up on YouTube, there's a lot of footage that deals with what telescopes actually capture when they're looking into space versus a lot of the photos that we've been shown that NASA has supposedly captured with the Hubble Space Telescope and all this type of stuff. So that's a whole nother dimension that I explore as well in the VERTICON file. So it's packed with all this type of stuff, but it's definitely a subject that could be talked about for hours and hours and hours. Why could this be covered up? The truth won't remain hidden forever. Whatever the truth is, because it won't be.
Perhaps if it were to get out and we realized they were covering up the truth on this, the next question would be, well, what else are you covering up?
Exactly, and it would cast doubt onto the all of the scientific institutions around the world, and it would basically make them look like idiots. Like, yeah, by the way, we've been lying to you about this, and we've been lying to you about this, that, and the other, and so that would.
But you've got to trust us on this.
Exactly. So and at that point, if you can't trust someone with, if they're lying about something as grand as where we live, well, that's wow. I mean, what if that were the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and there were so many other things that they were lying to us about. So I think at this point, there comes a point that if if somebody has lied about something, and over time, if they're not wanting to come true about that, they have to carry that lie forward. They have to continue to propel the illusion of that, because they stand everything to lose. So, years and years later, you have to continue to build upon that lie. And if the lunar missions were a hoax, and we never really went to the moon for whatever reason, they would have to continue to carry that forward, which is very interesting considering that all of the footage from the lunar missions is supposedly lost. Now, other than you can find footage of it on YouTube that people have recorded from other sources, but the original footage, just like the technology that supposedly got us there, is just all of a sudden, we just destroyed that. It's missing. Something as historically monumental as you would think it would be for man landing on the moon, and they just lost it. So I'm just asking questions, and that's what this book does. Is it attempts to answer some of these questions, a lot of questions, but ultimately there are going to be more questions that spring from those initial questions about what else is there? What if this place that we've thought was a globe is actually not that, and not that how can I say this? It's not as we've been told that it is. And if so, then what is the truth? How far does the truth go? And what do we need to do in order to prove that? And if we can prove it, if it is provable, how do we awaken everybody to that? So it's
You mean that spherical globe that our teachers in school used to always, spin around? It may not actually be something based on reality? Shocking. Shocking, Brian.
That's right.
Shocking.
And you know what else? I also find it interesting that so many companies and corporations use the globe as their logo. From like, what do you see when you go see a movie? And it's like Universal comes up, and it's the globe, and it's spinning around, and it has all these type of things. A lot of companies, that globe has been so indoctrinated into us since the time that we're like, one younger than that it's very, very difficult to consider something other than that being where we live. It's actually referred to as something that's called cognitive dissonance. And I actually refer to this in the book. It's basically when you believe something so strongly that to believe the alternative actually causes you stress, because it literally blows your view of your worldview, essentially. And so it's not the easiest thing to consider that that where we live is not actually the way that we've been told that it is. It's almost like being told that your parents are not your parents, and that you don't come from where you thought you came from, and all of these things. It is a world-shattering possibility, revelation, possibly. So, for sure.
Yeah, we've all flown at 30,000 feet, most of us, and from that vantage point, yes, it looks flat. Now, there are many hills upon that flat pancake-like surface, but it does look flat from the distance that we normally fly up there at 30,000 feet. However, if you go higher than that, up to, say, 70,000 feet, now you're up there in the high altitude, such as the trip that Rick takes in this book, you can really get a much different perspective.
Absolutely. When I was doing research for the VERTICON file and trying to discover how high can planes fly without that, and the plane that's actually in the scene that you're referring to is a special high altitude plane that is able to fly at 70,000 feet. And at that point, when you're up at 70,000 feet, the sky is no longer blue above you. At that point, you can see black. But still, and from footage, and there's footage of this on YouTube, is that the horizon always rises to the eye of the observer. And the horizon is always flat as far out as you can see. You would think that if the Earth were actually a sphere, that it would drop in the distance, that the horizon would drop. But it doesn't do that. It rises up. So there are a lot of questions about that I wanted to kind of explore. But that's a very important scene in the VERTICON file, is when Donovan actually sees this for himself and begins to consider that what if these things were true, that he thought all of his life were not as he was told that they were, about the world and whatnot. So, but what's interesting is if you try to look up footage dealing with high altitude type footage, I think about the highest that you can legitimately get. But see, a lot of these recordings that we find is made using a fisheye lens, and a fisheye lens it's designed to make lines curve. So this makes the horizon curve. And a lot of these that NASA uses, a lot of these types of cameras, they all have fisheye lenses, the GoPro cameras and whatnot. But if you actually use cameras that don't have that, the horizon is completely flat for as far out as you can see. It's extremely interesting. And it's kind of funny. A lot of times these cameras, from the moment they're lifting off from the Earth, you can already see the curvature from not even 1,000 feet. I'm like, wow, that we must be on a small Earth if there's that much curvature that far down. It's just it's interesting. So it's an interesting subject to look into.
And Brian, as well, you've written some faith-based series of books, and there's also a tie-in to this whole flat Earth with what it says in the Bible, which science seems to reject, but it does address a stationary plane.
That's right. The Bible, for those who actually accept that, is basically a flat Earth book, because it talks about the four corners of the earth, and God sits above the circle of the earth, and it talks about something called the firmament, and which is actually referenced in the VERTICON file as well. The firmament being, according to the Genesis account, being this glass-like structure covering the earth like a dome. Like, remember the TV show The Dome that was on a few years ago? I think that was based off of like a Stephen King story. It's similar to that, except instead of over a city, it's over the whole world. And it talks about how within the firmament you have the sun and the moon are within the firmament, and that there's water above and below. So I researched all that as well, and now there are a lot of different camps within the flat Earth community, and some believe in the firmament, some don't believe in the firmament. Some flat Earth people are Christians, some aren't Christians. So there's so many different variations between different belief systems, even within the flat Earth community, that it's notable as well. But yes, in terms of that element being the biblical element, that was definitely taken into account. The fact that if the earth is flat and there is a such thing as the firmament, then that would certainly give credence to the creation account and the Bible and the Scripture. What's also interesting is that there's footage of all of these missiles and so forth being launched. Now, this goes back to Operation Dominic and Operation Fishbowl, which we did a lot of high altitude nuclear testing. Something called Starfish Prime that involved this extremely large nuclear ballistic. That in this footage you see these missiles and these explosives explode, and it looks like they're hitting something up there. Like it looks like they're however high. Now it's debatable if there is a firmament. You consider what's known as the Van Allen belt, which is supposedly this radiation belt that the astronauts pass through going to the moon, which has to be protected, or radiation will get into the shuttle. So that's also kind of an interesting paradigm as well, is how do you reconcile these two things together? If we have gone to the moon, we've been through the radiation, the Van Allen radiation belt, but some of the astronauts claim they don't know anything about the radiation belt. So it's, not all of the stories from the astronauts harmonize within themselves. So that's an interesting subject as well. But I personally found the whole idea of this glass-like firmament above us to be very, very interesting. Because if you look at some of the amateur footage from some of these telescopes of these stars, these lights, they're pulsating, they're changing colors, and it looks like they're in water a lot of times from this footage. Not the pictures that we've been shown of Mars and all these other planets but the ones that people have recorded using telescopes that they've actually bought. Another interesting subject involves the moon. Is how far away is the moon? How close is the moon? There is an app that you can download for your phone that deals with judging distance and how far away something is. And you can do it if you have two different points, then you can triangulate the third point. I'm
going to have to hold you there for the hour. Remember where you are. We'll pick it right back up when we come back with Brian Weimer, author of the VERTICON file. I'm Jeremy Scott. Stick with us.
Are you connected with us on social media? Give us a like and follow @Paranormal Show. From the cold, dark depths of a secret dungeon, somewhere deep in the remote Pacific Northwest, you're traveling into the paranormal with Jeremy Scott.
Jumping right back into our conversation with Brian Weimer, author of the VERTICON File. Brian, continue, please.
Oh, sure. I went long that last time. I apologize for that.
Not at all.
I was basically just saying that there's this app that you can download that deals with trajectory, and it deals with how you can determine how far something is away if you have 2 points where, so you have 2 people and you can triangulate between the distance between 2 and how you can triangulate that third point. And there were a couple guys that were using this particular app, and so one of them was in one state and one was in the other. I'm trying to remember exactly where they were at. I can't. And they triangulated the distance to the moon. And I believe it told him that the moon was only like a couple hundred miles away or something like that. So that's kind of interesting. And I'm not saying I completely believe that or I don't believe it. But I believe that there could be some truth to, the fact that the sun isn't 93 million miles away as we've been led to believe. And that and if it's not, and we're not on a globe that's 23,000 miles in circumference, and we're not rotating around the sun and all of these things. Another thing to consider is also for those of you who are interested in going down this rabbit hole and learning more about flat Earth and what people believe about it, is the fact that you have the North Star, Polaris, which is located directly above the North Pole, and how the the stars and the constellations all revolve around. It never changes. I'm talking about being right over the North Pole. And you would think that if the Earth were rotating and all of these motions were going on, that would not be the case. Year after year, season after season, the stars would not be rotating sequentially the way that they have for thousands of years. It's something that's interesting to explore as well. So there's so many different things you could say about it. So many different things you can research and whatnot. I fit a lot of these things into the VERTICON File as much as I could, like I said, without making it a textbook and making it part of the plot. But at the end of the day, the VERTICON File is a conspiracy thriller. It's an action thriller that has elements of political espionage, conspiracies, government cover-up. But it's a suspense thriller ultimately, and I believe it's the first of its kind.
Well, and there's even a part of this that takes place in the state of Oregon, in my home state.
That's right. That's right. I knew that you lived there, Jeremy, and I'm just kidding. No, I love Oregon. I love the Pacific Northwest. I took a trip out to Portland several years ago. Fell in love with the place. Didn't have a chance to make it up to Seattle. But are
you moving here? Is that what you're saying?
Maybe one day. I would love to. I love that part of the country. There's just something about it that just is very inspirational to artists such as myself, for sure.
What would some of the main points be that you would like folks to take away from? I want them to go pick up the book. And by the way, it's on Amazon. It's from Jumpmaster Press. And you can go to brianweimer.com, and Weimer is spelled Weimer. Brian,
right.
Brian. Just go to paranormalradio.com. We've made it easy there for you to hit his website and also to get on to Amazon. But what are some of the main points?
Really, the main point, if I had to make it concise, would be just to look into things for yourself. Do your own research. Look into the truth for yourself, and instead of allowing things that you've been taught or things that you think that you understand because you were taught it when you were 1, 2, 3 years old. Especially in terms of where we live at, conspiracies. Look into it. Research conspiracies. Even the paranormal things, UFOs and extraterrestrials and interdimensional beings and ghosts. I enjoy all of those things as well, and that's important to be able to look into, to research those things. And basically, and I think you would agree with me, keep an open mind. Just keep an open mind. The VERTICON file is a story that asks, what if these things were true? I'm not saying that they are for sure, because I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anybody else does either. But to be able to ask these questions is one of the reasons that we explore. It's one of the reasons that we go see movies. It's one of the reasons that we read books, is because we have imaginations, and we're supposed to be able to ask and explore and go to all of these places. So that's what I hope readers take away from it, is the fact that I think it's an interesting story, and I think there's a lot that you can get out of it, even on a personal level, on being a truth seeker in your own life. Seek the truth for yourself. Absolutely.
Brian, it's been a privilege talking with you tonight. I wish you the very best with the book. Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. That's Brian Weimer. And go to paranormalradio.com. You'll find all the information there to check out the book. Because when you really think about it, friends, I mean, these subjects fascinate us all. We are all interested in these kinds of subjects. And the fact that, well, we may not be being told the truth about them shouldn't really come as a surprise to you and I, but it certainly does make it interesting to ponder.